a communication studies student and also the general manager of Clemson Television here in our student media department at Clemson. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today here at the Strom Thurmond Institute. I'd like to thank the Communication Studies Department, the Pierce Center for Professional Communication, the College of Architecture, Arts, and Humanities, as well as the Media Relations Department and the Strom Thurmond Institute for all sponsoring this lecture. Our speaker today has had an extremely lauded career in journalism. He graduated from Texas Tech University and went on to report in the Dallas area until he joined CBS News, based in New York. He became the chief White House correspondent for CBS during the Clinton administration after covering the president's election campaign. Additionally, as one of the first reporters to arrive at Ground Zero after the September 11th attacks, he continued his coverage of the U.S. war on terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan. However, instead of embedding with U.S. forces in Iraq, as most other journalists have done, he and his crew traveled around the country on their own and documented some of the war's most powerful stories. Since 2004, he's been a member of the CBS 60 Minutes team, interviewing such notable people as Presidents Barack Obama and George W. Bush, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke, as well as Afghan President Hamid Karzai and Iranian President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Most recently, in June 2011, he became the anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News. Please join me in welcoming Scott Pelley.
Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you so much. What a terrific welcome. I appreciate that. And Dean Goodstein, thank you very much for having us here today. Mrs. Goodstein, thank you. Great to be with you. And Eddie Smith, wherever you are, generally everywhere, thank you so much for this kind invitation. It's great to be at Clemson. My son is a student here, and my family has gotten to know Clemson over this last couple of years, and we have been thrilled to be part of the Clemson family. You know, I wonder, did anyone by any chance happen to catch the game yesterday? How about that? Wasn't that sensational? We were there at the game, and hopefully the turnout will be better next time. But coming off that win against Auburn and now Florida State, what an amazing thing. My first experience at Clemson University was about 2 years ago at the Florida State game that year. My son came here to see if we liked this university, and we watched that game, and we beat Florida State that day as well. And my son turned to me and said, "This is the place. This is it." And I said, "Well, son, they're lying." He said, No, this is it." And sure enough, it has been a wonderful experience for all of us. Well, I have been the managing editor of the CBS Evening News for all of about 5 months now. It's been a terrific opportunity to lead an amazing team of men and women who are working all around the world to bring you the news every evening at 6:30. The broadcast has been on the air for 63 years. And so that's an amazing tradition, especially at CBS News. And what I'd like to do today is describe to you a few of the things that we've been covering over those years and talk to you about some of the interviews that I've had an opportunity to do, both for the CBS Evening News and also for 60 Minutes. Tonight, Sunday night at 7 o'clock, we will premiere the 44th season of 60 Minutes. Thank you very much. Created by the brilliant CBS News executive producer Don Hewitt 44 years ago. 1968 was when 60 Minutes went on the air, and it is still today, after all these decades, the #1 news program in America. And I'm really proud to say that our app on the iPad is the #1 paid news app in America, so we must be doing something right after all of these years. Don Hewitt invented the evening news that you're familiar with back in the 50s, and then went on to invent 60 Minutes. And I had an opportunity to work with Don over these years, and it was a great formative experience for me. You know, a lot of people are concerned, of course, and well they should be, about where America stands just at the moment. We are experiencing today the worst recovery from a recession that we've ever had in our history. And we've had unemployment around 9% for 28 months now. The country has never seen that before. So we have been doing a lot of work in Washington about what our leadership among the Democrats and Republicans are doing about all of that. And I had a chance to speak with President Obama and with House Speaker Boehner about the logjam that we have experienced over getting the national debt down so that business can once again have the kind of confidence that's necessary to create jobs in this country. Now, we are in Pickens County. Of all the counties in South Carolina, Pickens was #1 in voting for John McCain. All the counties in South Carolina, this is the John McCain territory right here. 72% of the vote in 2008. Given that, I'm going to start with the President of the United States in deference to the office of the President of the United States. Now, Parker here has my life in his hands. He is the guy with his finger on the space bar of my PowerPoint presentation. And Parker's never seen this PowerPoint presentation. So if there are any errors here, they're all mine, not Parker's. But we'll start with a conversation that I had with the President just a short time ago about the difficulty of getting the Republicans and the Democrats together in order to move the country forward. Parker?
You know, a lot of folks at home see
the
this
speaker.
as a train wreck, and they're angry about it. And I wonder if you understand their feelings.
I do. I talk to people all day, every day. And the business of legislating in a divided government really is never pretty. You know, you've heard the old adage, there's two things you should never watch. Laws being made and sausage being made. And what we've got is we've got divided government here in Washington. We've got big issues confronting us. And we have a very open process and open society. And as a result, we have healthy debates about how to move forward. This has certainly been a long, healthy debate. But it's not pretty.
How did the grand bargain fail?
You know, I did everything I could to try to come to an agreement with the President. And unfortunately, he just kept insisting on new taxes. I made pretty clear throughout the spring that we weren't going to raise the debt limit without serious cuts in spending and changes to the way we spend the American people's money. And secondly, that we weren't going to have any new taxes. I even went to New York, to the New York Economic Club, gave a speech where I said that the cuts have to be larger than the increase in the debt ceiling. And people here in Washington thought I was crazy. But the fact is, when you've got a credit card that's out of control and over its limit, and you're asking the limit to be increased, you've got to do something about the source of the problem. And Washington spends too much money.
So as you know, the Republican stance is, as led by Speaker Boehner from Ohio, that we have to cut our way out of this problem. The government, as he just said, spends way too much money, and the thing to do is to not raise taxes, but to reduce the spending of the federal government. The Democrats, by and large, have a different view. They agree that spending has to be cut, but they also believe that taxes have to be raised, and there you have the loggerheads that the country finds itself in just now. There's a super committee made up of an equal number of Republicans and Democrats that are trying to find their way to a compromise, and they have until December the 23rd to find that compromise. But so far, we are still, even in that committee, in a place where some of them do not want to raise taxes on anyone, and some do not want to cut spending on anything, and it's going to be interesting to see how all of that works out. Speaker Boehner is a unapologetic smoker. And I was in his office in the House chamber the other day, and he was smoking cigarette after cigarette after cigarette. One of the benefits of being a top executive in the federal government is you can actually go down to the National Gallery with all these spectacular paintings, most of which are not on display. They're in a warehouse, actually. And you can choose paintings for your office from the greatest masters in the collection. It's an amazing perk. So Speaker Boehner had a magnificent portrait up on his wall in his office, and I always commented. I asked him what it was, and he told me who the painter was and all of that, and he finally said, of course, it's just a copy. And I said, a copy? What do you mean it's a copy? He goes, they won't let me have any originals because I smoke. So they make photographs of these great masters, they blow them up, they frame them like originals, and they put them up in the Speaker's office. The House is strictly non-smoking, but somehow that word has not reached the Speaker's office. He smokes them one after another. It's an amazing thing. When I asked him why the House and the Senate seem so opposed to getting anything moving forward, it's left, right, and never forward, he said, you have to understand, the founders created the Congress to be a body that doesn't work well. That's what they wanted. They didn't want politicians in Washington to be able to run away with the ball and do anything they wanted to do with the rest of the country. And so therefore, my job as Speaker of the House is to try to make something that's designed to work poorly work for the country. And it's a really frustrating thing to be Speaker of the House, without a doubt. I was talking to the President about these issues as well, and I always ask a President, every time I meet him, I always ask him the first time I meet him, do you like the job? That always causes them to pause for a moment or two. Never had a quick answer. And the President looked around and he said yes, and then he put his hand over the microphone on his lapel and said, except for the Congress. Abraham Lincoln said that he always knew he was going to hell, but he didn't realize it was only a mile up the road with a dome on top of it. I think most presidents feel much the same way. Parker, let's see if the next slide is a 60 Minutes logo. Yes. 60 Minutes will premiere tonight, as I mentioned, its 44th season, and some of the greatest work that I've had an opportunity to do, the greatest people that I've had an opportunity to work with, have been the men and women at 60 Minutes, and we do stories all around the world, and our boss, Jeff Fager, who's the executive producer, really only requires us to do one thing, and that is go anywhere in the world, find the most fascinating people and the most fascinating stories. What a great job. All of you who are involved in communication studies as students, let me tell you, this is a great way of life. To be able to go around the world or around the country or around your state and find the most interesting people and tell the most interesting stories. One of the things that occurred recently that we'll all remember was the spectacular disaster of the Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico a couple of summers ago. That was the big oil drilling platform out there that suffered that catastrophic explosion that killed 16 people and ended up unleashing the biggest oil spill that this country has ever seen, the biggest accidental oil spill that the world has ever seen. We wanted to cover that story in the early days, and we wanted to try to help the folks at home understand what happened, what caused that terrible disaster. And we met a gentleman by the name of Mike Williams. Mike Williams was the chief electronics officer on the Deepwater Horizon on the night of the explosion. And he was important because as the chief electronics officer, he knew the whole ship. Because these drilling platforms are like the space shuttle. They are the most amazing, most sophisticated kinds of rigs that you can imagine, all computerized, of course. Well, he was in charge of all the computers, and he knew how everything worked on the whole ship, from propulsion to emergency systems, etc. And we sat down with Mike about a week after the disaster, still with a scar right on his head here from where he was injured. And he sat down to tell us on 60 Minutes all about it. Parker, let's roll that. This is the Deepwater Horizon rig. Look at that. Imagine being on board. They were just finishing the well in the Gulf of Mexico. They were going to be off that well in 36 hours. They were putting the final touches on it so they could get off of that and move on. This was the safest rig in the world. It had the best safety record in the world at the time that this happened. The first thing that happened when the well failed, and this is 5 miles below them, imagine, 5 miles below the surface, the well fails and methane gas comes shooting up the pipe stem into the rig. The very first thing that happened was that gas began to spread out on the deck because it's heavier than air. And the giant engines that create all the electricity for the Deepwater Horizon start sucking that gas into the engines. And so the engines, instead of taking air in, are taking in methane gas. And so they rev up on this extra fuel at a speed far higher than they're designed to sustain. And that's where Mike Williams picked up the story for us. He's in his office on the deck, monitoring the systems as this all comes to pass. Parker?
I hear the engines revving. The lights are glowing. I'm hearing the alarms. I mean, they're at a constant state now. It's just beep, 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 beep. It doesn't stop. But even that's starting to get drowned out by the sound of the engine increasing in speed. And my lights get so incredibly bright that they physically explode. I'm pushing my way back from the desk when my computer monitor exploded, and I reached for the door to exit my shop. These are 3-inch thick steel fire-rated doors with 6 stainless steel hinges supporting them on the frame. As I reached for the handle, I heard this awful hissing noise, this whoosh, and at the height of the hiss, a huge explosion. The explosion literally rips the door from the hinges. It impacts me and takes me to the other side of the shop. And I'm up against the wall when I finally come around with a door on top of me. And I remember thinking to myself, this is it. I'm going to die right here. As I got to the next door, it exploded and took me, the door, and slid me about 35 feet backwards again and planted me up against another wall. At that point, I actually got angry. I was mad at the doors. I was mad that these fire doors that are supposed to protect me are hurting me. These fire doors are trying to kill me. And at that point, I made a decision. I'm going to get outside. I may die out there, but I'm going to get outside.
Every Sunday, they practice the lifeboat drill to make sure that in an emergency, everyone would be accounted for and everyone would get off the rig on a lifeboat. Mike Williams gets out of his office, up to the command deck, and discovers that the lifeboats are gone. He and several other people have been left behind. He meets another crew member, a woman named Andrea, and they are standing on the edge of the Deepwater Horizon in that inferno that we just saw. Parker? Standing on the edge of that deck, towering above the water.
I remember looking at Andrea and telling her, or looking at her and seeing that look in her eyes of she had quit, she had given up. I remember her saying, "I'm scared." And I said, "It's okay to be scared. I'm scared too." She said, "What are we going to do?" I said, "We're going to burn up or we're going to jump." And she said she couldn't jump. I remember telling her, "If you don't jump, I'm going to throw you. We have to get off of here. We can't stay here."
How far is it to the sea?
Maybe 90 feet, 100 feet. It's a long ways. I remember closing my eyes and saying a prayer and asking God to tell my wife, little girl, that Daddy did everything he could. And if I survive this, it's for a reason. I made those 3 steps, and I pushed off into the rig. And I fell for what seemed like forever. A lot of things go through your mind.
Wearing a life jacket, he and Andrea jumped off the rig and fell 100 feet to the sea. went way below the water, popped up again like corks, and discovered that the sea all around them, or near them at least, was on fire. And Mike Williams thought, what have I done? At least I was dry up there, and now I'm going to burn up down here. In that moment, far in the distance, he could hear somebody yelling, "Over here! Over here!" It was a fishing boat. Fishing boats were coming from all over the Gulf because they saw what happened. They heard the radio calls, the Mayday calls, and these average Americans, these fishermen, took their boats into that and started plucking survivors out of the water, and that's how Mike Williams came to survive to tell his story on 60 Minutes. As I mentioned to you, Mike was the chief electronics engineer on the ship, and so therefore he knew a lot about how the ship worked. And what the entire country was wondering in that first week was, what went wrong? How does the safest ship in the world end up with the biggest accident in the history of drilling offshore? And so, as you may recall from those days, there were a lot of congressional hearings that were going on at that very moment. There were hearings in the Senate, there were hearings in the House. Mike had told us a lot of things in that interview on 60 Minutes that no one had ever heard before about the trouble that the rig was having in the days and weeks before the accident occurred. Well, none of these things had been told to the investigators for the Senate or the House. And finally, it came time for the Interior Secretary, Ken Salazar, who's responsible for offshore drilling in this country, to appear before the House and the Senate. He appeared that Monday, that very morning, after the 60 Minutes broadcast. And here's what happened to Ken during the course of that day. And one more, Parker.
Last night I saw the rerun of the, in fact I saw it 3 times, Mike Williams on 60 Minutes. I'm sure all of you saw that.
I did not watch the 60-minute episode that you referred to.
The 60 Minutes did a piece, as is so often the case, that I thought was really interesting.
We hear from on 60 Minutes what we couldn't hear from industry witnesses.
I don't know if you had the chance to see the 60 Minutes call it expose.
I did not watch the 60-minute program.
I watched 60 Minutes on Sunday.
I did not watch it because I have been working on the Gulf incident nonstop, so
This is the Gulf incident we're talking about.
So the moral of the story is, don't miss 60 Minutes. One of the things that we've been covering on 60 Minutes a great deal is what we started this conversation with, and that is the difficult economic times that the country finds itself in. And of course, we all remember what happened in 2008 when the banking system collapsed and set us on this path for a continued recession and then the worst recovery that we've ever had. It seemed to me, with all the things that Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, was doing, all of the extraordinary efforts that the Fed was taking during the banking collapse, that it was time for the chairman of the Fed to sit down and do an interview. Now, this never happens. The chairman of the Fed traditionally does not do interviews. So I called over to the Federal Reserve and I explained our rationale to them, and the public relations guy for the chairman listened to me, and when I stopped, he laughed out loud and said, "The chairman never does interviews." Parker? And one more.
We're sitting on this corner where your family store was, and I see it's Main Street.
Yes?
People feel like guys like you are tuned into what happens on Wall Street, and you forget places like this.
You know, I come from Main Street. That's my background. And I've never been on Wall Street. And I care about Wall Street for one reason and one reason only, because what happens on Wall Street matters to Main Street. And if we don't have stabilization in the financial markets, if we don't take the steps necessary to make sure that credit is flowing again, then my father couldn't get a loan to build his new store.
Does anybody here know where that main street is? Dillon, South Carolina. That's exactly right. Ben Bernanke, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, is from Dillon, South Carolina. He was one of those kids, you know, he was the smartest kid in town. And when he was in Dillon High School and discovered that they didn't offer calculus at Dillon High School in those days, he taught himself calculus. He was offered a position at Harvard. His mother didn't want him to go. He didn't have the clothes, she told him, to go back east and go to school in Harvard. But of course he did go to Harvard. Later became chairman of economics at Princeton, and later became the Federal Reserve chairman as nominated by President Bush. People will argue about the role of the Federal Reserve. People will have reasonable arguments about whether the Fed has done too much or not enough in this economic crisis that we're in. But let me just say this about Ben Bernanke. His academic specialty, the thing that he spent his life working on in academia, was the causes of the Great Depression. He is one of the world's leading experts on the causes of the Great Depression. And when he saw 2008 happen, he thought it was happening all over again. And so he threw $2 trillion at the crisis in that moment to provide the world banking system with enough liquidity to keep from freezing up. He was afraid that we were going to go from a really bad recession all the way into the Great Depression too. I think history is going to bear him out on this. Nobody's happy with the way the economy is now, but Chairman Bernanke, and a lot of people who understand these things better than I do, will tell you that it would be a whole lot worse. You'll recall that in 2008, the Congress was debating what to do, the President was debating what to do, all the time that the banks and the financial markets are seizing up. Ben Bernanke, on his own volition, didn't have to debate with anybody. He didn't have to get anybody to sign off on Capitol Hill. He didn't have to write a new law and get it passed. He just did it. He just picked up the phone and threw $2 trillion of liquidity at the problem in order to prevent the Great Depression too. Where did Ben Bernanke get his insight into work, what it is to work, what it is to run a business? Well, I'll show you. Next one, please. That's right. How many of you know this place? Oh yeah. South of the border, outside Dillon, South Carolina, Ben Bernanke would come back in the summers from Harvard and put on a poncho and wait tables at south of the border. And I asked him, I said, what did you learn about work? And he said, well, you know, I learned that work is hard. Next slide, please, Parker. The greatest event that I've ever had an opportunity to cover, of course, was the attack on our country on 9/11. I just happened to be in Manhattan on that day, and when the first aircraft hit the first tower of the World Trade Center, we recognized at 60 Minutes that whatever it was, and we didn't know what it was in that moment, but whatever it was going to be a big story. And so we sent a whole bunch of people down there. And as we were heading down there, the second airplane hit, and then it became pretty apparent pretty quickly what was going on. I was running down the West Side Highway trying to get to the scene. This is as the first tower is burning and just before the second tower was hit. Thousands upon thousands of people were running up the West Side Highway, which runs along the Hudson River, trying to get out of there. And as I was running down, I kept slipping and tripping over something. There were so many people, it was such a crowd, I couldn't quite make out what it was. But after a while, there was a break in a crowd, and I noticed that it was women's high heels. Women had come out of their shoes, had left their high heels all over the West Side Highway as they were running, now barefoot or in their stocking feet, to get away from the scene. When I arrived down at the World Trade Center, the first tower had fallen by that point. I didn't know that because when you're in Manhattan, as a lot of people know, you're surrounded by buildings and you can't see a great distance. But I came around the corner and the first building had fallen, and I looked and I remember wondering, where is it? Where is the other building? The second tower to fall was actually tower number 1, and as I reached it, it was still on fire. And I looked up at the top of the building with a big television mast tower on top, and it seemed to move. And I thought it was just a trick of the heat in the light, that it was shimmering somehow. But then in that very moment, you know, people always say that these things seem to happen in slow motion, and I'm here to tell you that it's true. I watched the 110th floor fall on 109, and then fall on 108, and then fall on 107. Now, of course, that's not the way it happened. You've all seen it. The building came rushing down at near supersonic speed, but that's the way it looked. And when I realized the building was collapsing, the next rationale I had, the next rationalization that I had was, well, it'll stop. It'll fall 10 floors, it'll fall 15 floors, and then it'll stop. And then, of course, it just gathered speed as it rushed down, and that enormous hurricane of powder and dust went shooting all over everyone and everything, shooting up and down the canyons of lower Manhattan. And when that dust finally began to settle and we could see again, it was incredibly silent. It was like the first heavy snowfall of winter. Nothing was moving. We started moving toward the base of the tower at that point. And what I noticed immediately was there was nothing recognizable anywhere. Imagine the doors, the computers, the typewriters, the filing cabinets, the office furniture, the carpet. Imagine all the things that were in those buildings. And there was not one single thing that was recognizable. Not one. It had all been turned into this grayish powder, which was now blowing through the streets of lower Manhattan and beginning to drift like snow. There were drifts of 5 feet and 6 feet high of this powder. I had covered the bombing of the World Trade Center way back in 1993, and there was a fact stuck in my head from that incident. I remembered from that at any given moment there were 25,000 people in each tower. And as I saw that tower collapsing, I thought I was witnessing the deaths of 25,000 people. And I couldn't think of anything to do but just fall to my knees in that moment and pray to God that He'd take all of those people with as little pain as possible. Now, history tells us that the evacuation of the World Trade Center towers was enormously successful. Almost everyone below the point of impact in each tower survived. No one, of course, above the point of impact was able to survive. The airplanes had cut through the building so completely. But just under 3,000 people lost their lives. 347 of those people were New York City firefighters. So many people were surprised that the buildings collapsed. I mean, steel buildings don't collapse, but we learned, of course, or were reminded, that if you burn steel hot enough, long enough, it will melt. That is, after all, how you make steel to begin with. Nobody really knew that. Nobody grasped that problem, except the 347 members of the FDNY. They'd all been trained. They knew what was going to happen. And they went into those buildings anyway. It was an amazing thing to have seen and to have experienced. About a year after 9/11, we had an opportunity to talk with President Bush, and we shot a special one-hour program for 60 Minutes with President Bush on the first anniversary of 9/11 to talk about what had happened around the White House and what had happened in his day on that day. You'll remember that he was in Florida. He wasn't in Washington. He was actually at an event. He was reading to some third-grade school children when this happened. We wanted to recreate some of those moments, and he spent most of his day, as a lot of you will recall, on Air Force One, flying back up from Florida, and they frankly wanted to keep the president up in an airplane because after what had happened that morning, nobody could tell what the heck was going to be happening all around the country, and they just felt the president was safer in an airplane flying around. So they put him in Air Force One, they put fighter planes all around Air Force One, and they flew him all around the country for several hours until things began to become more clear. Parker, if you would, please. And again, if you would. One more time. There we are. This is the president walking down the aisle of Air Force One. This is a pretty nice plane that we have afforded the President of the United States, as you can see. And the aisle, instead of running down the middle, it runs down along one side. And we had an opportunity to speak with the President. One of the things that I wanted to talk to him about, one of the things that surprised me, actually, when we were up in his office at the front of the airplane, near the front of the airplane, he told us about a moment that he described as one of the most difficult moments of the day. He had to make a decision, and he had to give the Air Force an order. And when he gave that order to the Air Force, it was so difficult for him, he felt like he had to be alone. And so he walked up into his stateroom, his bedroom on the airplane in order to pick up the phone and give the Air Force this order. And this is what he told us.
But there's a bedroom here that's got phones up front, and I actually left the office here to go give the order to prepare our aircraft to shoot down our own commercial airliners should they violate certain airspace rules or transponder rules.
Why did you walk in the other cabin to give that order?
You know, I don't know. I can't remember. I just did. Maybe it was one of those moments where I wanted to be alone.
Tough order.
It's a tough order. It's a tough one to give. It kind of, in retrospect, that order reminds us of how serious the moment was. When your country's under attack, and you're not sure if there's going to be another attack, you got to do everything you can to protect the American people. And the idea of ordering our own aircraft to shoot down our own aircraft was a tough call, but it was, I didn't hesitate. It was the right thing to do.
After that interview, Air Force One that day was flying to a forestry event in Oregon, and the President wore a suit for our interview, but to do the forestry event where he was going to describe a new national policy on forestry, he wanted to wear something a little more outdoorsy. It was going to be in the forest. So he went up into his stateroom from his office to his stateroom to change clothes. And so my team and I, we're all back in the President's office, and we're taking the lights down and getting the gear out of his office and all that sort of thing. And apparently, the President realized that there was something that he wanted to tell me that he forgot to mention. So he comes back in the office. Now, I have no idea what the President of the United States said to me in that moment, because he's not wearing a shirt. This is the kind of guy President Bush is. He's very casual around people, and he walks in, and I'm looking him straight in the eyes. And I'm not looking down, and I'm just sitting there thinking to myself, the President's not wearing a shirt. I'm not looking down. The President's not wearing a shirt. I am not looking down. And the President finished his point, whatever it was, turned and walked back into his stateroom, and we all looked at each other and said, well, you don't see that every day. No earthly idea what he was trying to communicate to us in that moment. Now, an interesting story came up on 60 Minutes and I was so mad at my colleague Mike Wallace about it because it was just absolutely absurd. He did a story in the weeks after 9/11 about whether the United States would resort to torture in order to get information out of terrorists after this horrible thing that had happened to our country. And it just struck me as a ridiculous notion that we would never do that kind of thing. And yet we began to learn in the weeks and months, many months, the years after 9/11, we began to learn a little bit about waterboarding and what the CIA was doing in order to extract information from terrorists in those early days when we didn't know whether they were going to attack again. I had an opportunity to do the very first interview ever with George Tenet. George Tenet was the CIA director. He was the CIA director before 9/11, during 9/11, and after 9/11. He had never done an interview in his life. He had been the subject of an enormous amount of criticism over years, which he'd never been able to respond to because he believed that CIA directors should never do interviews, kind of like Chairman of the Federal Reserve. Well, we finally got Director Tenet to sit down with us, and one of the subjects that came up in that interview was the question of waterboarding and whether it was torture. Have a look at his first public comments on that subject. Next one, please. There it is. Let me see if that's it.
You know, the image that's been portrayed is we sat around the campfire and said, oh boy, now we go get to torture people. Well, we don't torture people. Let me say that again to you. We don't torture people. Okay?
Come on, George.
We don't torture people.
Khalid Sheikh Mohammed.
We don't torture people.
Waterboarding.
We do not, I don't talk about techniques and we don't torture people. No, listen to me. I want you to listen to me. So the context is, it's post 9/11. I've got reports of nuclear weapons in New York City, apartment buildings that are going to be blown up, planes that are going to fly into airports all over again, plot lines that I don't know. I don't know what's going on inside the United States, and I'm struggling to find out where the next disaster is going to occur. Everybody forgets one central context of what we lived through. The palpable fear that we felt on the basis of the fact that there was so much we did not know. I know that this program has saved lives. I know we've disrupted plots.
But what you're essentially saying is some people need to be tortured.
No, I did not say that. I did not say that.
You're telling me that the enhanced interrogation...
I did not say that. We do not torture. Listen to me.
Well, you're making in the book enhanced interrogation.
Well, that's what we call it.
That's a euphemism.
Well, I'm not having a semantic debate with you. I'm telling you what I believe.
Anybody ever die in the interrogation program?
No.
You're sure of that?
Yeah. In this program that you and I are talking about, no.
Have you ever seen any of these interrogations done?
No.
Didn't you feel like it was your responsibility to know what you were signing off on?
I'm not a voyeur. I understand what I was signing off on.
Lose any sleep over it?
Yeah, of course you do. Of course you lose sleep over it. You're on new territory, but that's not the point. What's this tension? So the tension is, I've just lived through 3,000 people dying. This is not a clinical exercise. Maybe for you guys it's a clinical exercise. Not for me. 3,000 people died. Friends died. Now I'm going to sit back, and then everybody says, you idiots don't know how to connect the dots. You don't have imagination. You are unwilling to take risks to protect this country.
Let me ask the question this way. Why were enhanced interrogation techniques necessary?
Because these are people that will never, ever, ever tell you a thing. These are people who know who's responsible for the next terrorist attack. These are hardened people that would kill you and me 30 seconds after they got out of wherever they're being held and wouldn't blink an eyelash. You can sit there 5 years later and have this debate with me. All I'm asking you to do, walk a mile in my shoes when I'm dealing with these realities.
Reasonable people will disagree about this policy. We have only fairly recently learned that the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, of course, was the mastermind of 9/11. He's the guy who figured out how to do it, and he's the guy who got it done. He's now in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed turned up the name of the courier who we've been following for years to get Osama bin Laden. Worth it? Reasonable people will debate this for a very long time. You cannot debate George Tenet's passion when it comes to running the CIA in those days and what he believed was the right thing to do in the moments after 9/11. Now, I want to have enough time to take a few questions, and I think we've got 10 or 15 minutes left here in this hour. And so I want to be sure that the room has been set up for questions. I take it we're supposed to use these microphones right here on the left and the right, and I'd be really proud to take your questions. But before we do that, let me just tell you that what we're trying to do at CBS News every day is simply this: original reporting, unique insight into the news, and fairness. Fairness to everyone who is involved in a story. Those are the hallmarks of 60 Minutes and the hallmarks of the CBS Evening News. And I'll just ask you to remember one thing the next time you watch one of the broadcasts. Please remember, as we all do at CBS News every day, that every broadcast, every single day, somebody somewhere at CBS News risked their life to bring the news to the American people. It happens at other news organizations every day as well. We have the greatest journalism in the world. No one else comes close. No country comes close. One of the reasons we have the greatest journalism in the world is because we have the greatest journalism schools in the world. But one of the things that gives our country strength is the quality of the journalism that we can all watch on television for free or spend $1 for a newspaper to get the very best writers and reporters on the planet. And it is a great American luxury, I like to think, that we have so much great reporting at our fingertips every day. I sure want to thank you for this great opportunity. Our family has come to love Clemson University. I want to thank you for a great educational opportunity for my son, and thank you for allowing us to be part of your wonderful family here in South Carolina. Thank you very much indeed. Now, if anybody would like to come forward, I'll take questions on anything that you like. I'll do my best to answer them. Politics, the way we cover the news, how we cover the news, any insights, any thoughts on what we're doing. Ma'am, would you like to come up to the microphone, or can I can probably just hear you?
I think I have 3 left.
You're doing fine.
I wondered how often you have to trust your gut in an interview, and when you decide to disregard your gut because, for the sake of keeping the interview going, or for political correctness, or for whatever, is your gut a big part of how you work?
We don't worry so much about political correctness, but you've really hit it right on the head, and I like to tell journalism students about this all the time. You always go into an interview with your questions all written down. Those are never the questions that create moments like the one with George Tenet. All of those questions that I asked him were not written down. The first question was, and then it's the follow-ups that matter. It's always the follow-ups that matter. Thinking on your feet, listening to what you're being told, and going in and getting more detail all the time. And that's what you saw in the George Tenet interview. I sat down for a different interview with President Bush once. We were at Camp David. And I sat down and he sat down. We were knee to knee with one another, and I had my questions on my lap. And he looked over and he said, "Those your questions?" And I said, "Yes, sir, Mr. President." He goes, "Well, you better start cutting them back." Somebody asked me, what do they allow you to ask the president? Boy, that's a hell of a question to ask in the United States of America. The answer is we ask the president anything we want to. But the one thing the White House, any White House, Republican or Democrat, can do is they can restrict the amount of time you have with the president. So they will, in order to restrict the number of follow-ups you can ask. So you'll get 15 minutes or 30 minutes with the president. In the last interview I did with President Bush, they had a guy off camera standing behind the president with cards. And as the interview went on, he'd hold up the cards. 2 minutes, 1 minute, you know, and so that we knew that we were running out of time. And when we ran out of time, the president's press secretary said, "Thank you very much, the interview's concluded." And the president looked over at him and goes, "No, we can go on. It's okay." And so we did. Yes, here's one of our great Channel 7 people right here.
Scott, it's wonderful to have you here. I was wondering, I know that you started in Texas. How was the transition to the network, and how did that come about?
Well, I started at a little wood-burning TV station literally in the middle of a cotton field out in Lubbock, Texas. It was the 137th market, and started in this business as a copy boy at the Lubbock Avalanche Journal newspaper. I worked the overnight shift in the wire room when I was 15 years old. I had to lie about my age, to be honest. To be honest now, I wasn't honest then. My career in search of the truth began with a lie, but they only hired kids who were 16 and above, and so I went and I told them I was 16. My mom used to have to drop me off at about 3 blocks from the paper so I could walk in so that nobody could see that I wasn't driving. And so I worked the 3 to midnight shift, which was perfect for a high school kid. I got out of school at 2:30, went to the job at 3, worked till midnight, and worked in the wire room, and then started working in television. And in that little bitty TV station, you had to drive through the cotton to get to the station, literally. You had to do everything. You shot the stories, you processed the film, you cut the film. This is film, kids. None of you have ever seen it before, but some of you out there will remember it. And then you wrote the 10 o'clock news, and you did radio on the weekends. And you know, those experiences are experiences that I use each and every day at the CBS Evening News and at 60 Minutes as well. It's a great experience. And then a very unlikely thing happened. Because I knew some people, I got a job. I went from Lubbock to Dallas. I went from the 137th market to the 10th. It shouldn't have happened. It could never happen again. And it shouldn't have happened in my case, but I hung on by my fingernails, and I met my future wife there. And once I'd met her, I couldn't leave. So I had to figure out how to be a good reporter quick, and I had a lot of great people helping me. I happen to be the most visible part of CBS News at 6:30 any given day, but I'm not the most important part. Please don't adopt that common misunderstanding. It's not the anchorman. It's the 300 people who worked on the broadcast all around the world all day, the reporters, the cameramen, the soundmen, the editor. It's that ensemble of people, the people who risk their lives to cover the news. They're the important people. My job as the anchorman at the end of the day is to get out of the way and let all those people shine through. Yes, ma'am. Stories of 9/11 that we couldn't get to, that we really wanted to get to. Boy, what a great question. There was so much coverage in those days, and we spoke to so many families in those days about their experiences and about their losses and the losses in the FDNY and the NYPD on that day. I really can't think of anything that we didn't get to tell you the truth. We were in Afghanistan right after that happened, when the invasion of Afghanistan happened. Invasion of Afghanistan, we're about to hit the 10th anniversary. That's coming up in about 2 weeks, is the 10th anniversary of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan. And so we've been in Afghanistan quite a bit over those 10 years as well. It was a horrible tragedy that no one would ever want to see. But if that horrible tragedy was going to occur to my country, I was so honored to have the opportunity to be there and to write about those people, the firemen, the policemen, the people who saved others, and to write about those brave American men and women who went right into Afghanistan a month later. It was just such an honor to have an opportunity to tell those stories. And I think we got to the vast majority of them. Yes, sir.
One of the greatest issues facing my generation of students is solving America's energy and environmental challenges. So you interviewed the CEO of Duke Energy, and said some surprising things. Can you mind talking about that and what you thought?
Well, we did talk to the CEO of Duke Energy, and he was very interested in those days in essentially cleaning up coal. The United States is the Saudi Arabia of coal. We have more coal than any other country on earth. It is an enormous resource. Most of the energy generated in this country by our power plants, as a result, is generated by coal. There's just one big problem with that, and that is coal is the, if you will, dirtiest greenhouse gas emitting fossil fuel. It just is. So we're blessed enormously on one side with this incredible wealth of coal, and yet on the other side, it is a difficult problem in terms of greenhouse gas emitting gases. So a lot of time, energy, and research is going into trying to figure out how to have our cake and eat it too. How to clean up the emissions from coal so that we can use this very cheap and plentiful resource that we own, instead of importing it from someplace else in the country, in the world rather, and clean up those emissions so that we don't heat up the atmosphere and cause all of the problems attendant with global warming. It turns out to be an extremely difficult and expensive problem. There will be a technological fix to that. We will figure it out eventually. I think we have to figure it out because we've got to use the coal that we have, and yet we can't let the planet heat up beyond what it is already. And so I have to believe that there's going to be a solution to that problem, and the gentleman who runs Duke Energy was trying to make his power plants cleaner and still use coal. It's a tremendous challenge, and in a school here, in a university so famous for engineering, I hope a lot of our Clemson students are working on exactly this problem. If you're looking for an opportunity to increase the national security of the United States and save the world, this is a great place to work, is on this issue of taking America's plentiful and cheap and coal and turning it into a fuel that is friendlier for the environment. It's quite a challenge. Now we're running out of time. I don't know who my time proctor is in this room, but I'll take another question or two. Eddie, are you here? Oh, Eddie stepped out. Eddie Smith? Okay, all right. I just wanted to double check. I tell you what, I need to let all of you go. Let me take two more questions and we'll call it a day. Yes, sir.
My name is David Cohen. I'm a DJ and something of a news reporter at WSBF, campus radio station. And I was just wondering, do you have any say into what goes into the broadcast, and if so, how much?
That's my whole job. As I alluded to earlier, the anchoring part that I do at the end of the day is not the most important thing I do all day. I'm also the managing editor of the broadcast, and we go to work, my team of senior producers and I go to work about 7:30 in the morning, and we work all day figuring out what we're going to cover, how we're going to cover it, and what we're going to be able to put in our 30-minute broadcast from our bureaus all around the world. And then as the afternoon comes on, we start working on all the scripts. All the correspondents send in all their scripts, and I edit every script myself. I work with our writers to edit and write all of the parts of the broadcast. There really is no part of the broadcast that doesn't go through my hands. For better or worse, if you see something on the broadcast that you hated, well, that was me too. So I get that I don't always get it right, but I try to. And so we work a 13-hour day. Most of the people at CBS News seem to work a 13-hour day. And it's very time-consuming. It's a lot of work, but it's a labor of love. And so the answer to your question is I have my hands on just about everything. Yes?
I was just going to say, I'm Julia, by the way, and I wanted to say initially, what was the most difficult interview you've ever conducted, and how do you separate your personal life from your work life?
Oh boy, see, that's the trick. That's the trick at a White House news conference. You know, you're supposed to stand up and ask the president one question, but you get two questions in instead. And the president almost always plays. It amazes me that he'll answer both questions, but he does. So I'll answer both of yours. Most difficult interview, maybe the difficult but fun, was Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran. I had an opportunity to interview President Ahmadinejad. A couple of years ago, we were in Tehran. We were in his rose garden. Apparently, if you're a head of state, you have to have a rose garden. Hamid Karzai in Kabul has a rose garden outside his office. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has a rose garden. And of course, our rose garden is the most famous of all here in the United States. So I was determined to pin down Ahmadinejad and it was going to be a lot of fun because he's just the slipperiest character you would ever sit down with. He never answers a question. And so it was the follow-up questions again, same thing again. I wanted to get him to answer the question of whether they were building a nuclear weapon. And I asked him the question and he obfuscated, and I asked him a question again and he dodged it, and I asked him again and he dodged it, and I said, hey, you know what, you never say yes or no. And at one point he said, well, what are you looking for? And I said, I would like a yes or no. Are you building a nuclear weapon or are you not? And he obfuscated again. And I went back and followed up one more time. And finally he looked up at me and he said, are you a CIA agent? He says, this is Iran and I am president of this country, as in, how dare you talk to me that way? But he wasn't used to being on 60 Minutes, but now he's had that experience. And you don't separate your professional life and your personal life if you get it right. They're not separate things. They're two halves of a whole. And my wife Jane, who's here today, and I have been married for 28 years. And she has supported each and everything that I have done over all of these years, and I have supported her in all of the work that she's done, and it's a partnership. It's a wonderful partnership. I'm gone way too much. That's part of the job. I'm in hazardous places way too much. But when you think about it, there are a lot of Americans who are in hazardous places. Our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, police officers, firemen, go on and on and on. There are a lot of professions that are hazardous in that way, much more hazardous than mine. But Jane and I have worked together to raise our children and build a home and build a family, and frequently they go with me on assignment. My son and my daughter and my wife and I'll take them on a 60 Minutes assignment, and we'll go do something fun every once in a while. So it's the kind of thing that you never want to separate. You always want the professional side and the personal side to work together to create something important, and what's important is the family. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much. I'm really grateful to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Great to be with you. Thank you. Great to be with you. Thank you. Thank you very much.